Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 84, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
And me, Ravi Abbott.
Looking a bit green tonight, Ravi.
Oh, God, I'm looking a bit pale. I did the awful mistake of having a kebab on a Sunday at 10 at night. It's not good, guys, trust me.
Now, normally we record this show on like a Monday or Tuesday. We had to cancel yesterday's recording.
Yeah, because I felt so bad. But luckily our guests remained. And if we could get like a microphone to a sofa or something, or a toilet today, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we should actually pin the doors open in the studio and make a direct line to the toilet for you.
Yeah.
So if you hear Ravi's chair just spin round and running off out the room, then that's what it is. Hopefully we won't hear the follow-up noises from you.
No, I don't think I'm ever going to have a kebab again.
Lesson learned.
Yeah.
I must say, as a vegetarian, they don't look very nice.
No, and the amount of food poisoning, and my friend even got E. coli from a kebab. I was like, what have you been eating?
There are a lot of people, I've been a vegetarian since I was like 7 years old. And a lot of people are like, oh, but you do not look at meat and be like, oh, that must look amazing. And like, oh, you know, I'm going to turn to eating meat again.
You know, I'm the opposite, dude. I was vegetarian raised.
Yeah.
And I read Asterix, and the wild boars in Asterix look so succulent. I was like, I've got to try that. I felt like being Obelix for a while, you know.
So Asterix made you eat meat.
Yeah, that was it.
Sue the makers of Asterix for your food poisoning. But Ravi's on the mend now, though.
Yeah,
looking a bit healthier today.
Yeah. I'm back at work today, so it's all right.
So we've got an amazing guest who luckily did manage to arrange an interview so we can chat to him tonight, and this is going to be well worth it. If we're talking like, you know, iconic arcade characters, obviously we've got like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and iconic arcade stuff like Defender.
They're all from Japan, though, as well, aren't they?
A lot of them were, yeah. A lot of them were. But if we're talking, you know, maybe one that a lot of people will recognise and has a little bit more character than all of them put together, I think.
Yeah.
And he's very weird. Qbert.
Yeah, Qbert was one of the kind of main first characters that was successful in arcades coming from America. So, you know, you had Joust and Qbert were pretty much the American arcading games in the very, very early days. And you've probably seen him. Qbert in Pixels and, what's that, Wreck-It Ralph? He's probably going to be a Wreck-It Ralph too. Maybe even Ready Player One. He was mentioned in the book. So.
But he's a very weird little character, isn't he? He's got like his own language.
Qbertese, is it, or something?
But I was reading the story. I mean, we're going to find out more when we chat to our guest this week, who is Warren Davis, by the way, the man behind Qbert the arcade. He worked with the likes of Jeff Lee and David Thiel on it back in the day. Obviously, you know, back in the early 80s when he worked at Gottlieb, that were the company that developed that game. And, you know, they were actually a pinball company at first. And they had a lot of innovative technology there, including, you know, the Qbert machines had their own, like, physical knocker in there. When the character would fall to the bottom of the screen, you'd hear, like, in the arcade.
That's cool.
And also speech synthesis in there as well, that weird voice that he used. Which was actually a really good story behind that. So we're going to find out more about what I think is one of the most interesting characters, because you look at Qbert, what is he?
It's like, you know, you were transported to a surreal land with these older games, but the surreal land involved killing people. Pac-Man, he was eating stuff, but Qbert was avoiding stuff. He was just, you know, selecting blocks. It was a very different type of game.
He was trying to get on with his work, wasn't he? Leave me alone, everyone.
Yeah, rah.
We can all relate to that, can't we?
That's it.
So Qbert, we're going to get the story of, you know, what I think is one of the most creative early arcade titles, and, you know, a character that I think now is very dear to most long-time gamers' hearts, isn't he? Warren Davis is going to be our special guest on the Retro Hour in around 20 minutes from now. And speaking of special guests, obviously we have guests every week who write into the show now.
Oh, yes, letter section.
And we look forward to this. Obviously, if you ever want to get in touch with us, we read these out at the start of every show. All you got to do is drop us an email, show@theretrohour.com. Or, you know, you can drop us a message on Facebook or send us a tweet at Retro Hour UK if it's concise enough. But do you remember last week we were asking for pictures of people's retro battle stations?
Oh, yeah, show us your rig.
We've got a cool couple ones here I'm going to wear.
Oh, cool, I haven't seen these yet.
There you go.
Oh, nice.
Quicker than email to pass it over the table. Now, the first one that we've got here is of Tom Turner. He's known as Turbo Nips. And he sent us this picture of his retro battle station. He's working with quite limited space.
He's got a lot of stuff stacked up. I'm spotted a little kind of GameCube in the corner. He's got a Wii, an Amiga. That's on the top, of course.
Acorn Electron underneath, the Spectrum.
Spectrum, yeah. Oh, God, it's all there.
SNES, Mega CD2, a couple of modern consoles, but he's actually an Amstrad on the corner as well, if you might see.
He's really using that shelving, isn't he?
He is, yeah. So, you know, that's very cool. We'll stick that on our Facebook page. And also, a guy who's battle stations we've drooled over for many years. You probably see him in the Amiga groups. Our good friend George Toohey.
Oh my God, this guy's even gone to the lengths of having a UV light in there that kind of does the Amiga-y kind of rainbowy colours throughout the whole thing. It looks fantastic.
He has all. It's mainly Commodore machines. There's an Atari ST there as well, but he's got all the original boxes, CD32, Amiga 600.
He's got
C64.
framed articles on the wall, from the magazines. Underneath, he's got the original boxes. Yeah, you're right.
And then, on the second page, look what he's put in a frame in his office as well.
Ah, good man. A retro hour flyer. Paul Kitchen will be happy with that, being in a frame.
He said, I pinched it from Play Expo and Blackpool.
Excellent.
So please do keep the pictures coming in. We'll put those on our Facebook group. Just search for the Retro Hour podcast and let us know what your retro battle stations look like. We're always curious to look at that. And also we got a letter this week as well off Nick Lees. He goes, hey guys, listening to this week's podcast on my morning run here in the Mile High City, Denver, Colorado. I stopped here at Mile High Stadium, home of the Denver Broncos.
Ah, I've heard of them.
I've lived here for 10 years. I'm originally from the UK. I grew up with an Amstrad CPC as my first computer, which we got all the way back in 1985. I love listening to all your great interviews with the people who made computer gaming what it is today. Keep up the great work.
Oh, great. I hope he took his Amstrad over with him.
You don't see many Amstrads in America, do you?
No.
Yeah, so do keep your letters coming in. We'd love to give you a mention on next week's show at theretrohour.com. Now, of course, we couldn't do this show every week. We couldn't bring you the latest retro gaming news. We couldn't bring you these amazing guests without the people who make donations into the running of the Retro Hour podcast. Now, we mentioned this on last week's show. It's not a patron. It's nothing like that. This is more a tip jar, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. You just chuck in what you can afford. And I know people can't afford much at the moment. So whatever you have spare, a spare bit of Bitcoin, or, you've gone on holiday and you've got a few spare euros, just chuck them in there. And
obviously it all goes back into the running of the Retro Hour podcast. Every penny that we get allows us to keep doing this show every week. Ravi's not spending this cash on kebabs.
Oh, God, don't remind me.
So we've got to say a huge thank you this week in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame.
Holy Kiva Church Records.
Stelios Kalagrades.
Konstantinos Das Kalakis.
You've been practicing your Greek there, haven't you? And also Darren Coles, who all made donations into the running of the show. Thank you so much, guys. Really means a lot to us. And of course, if you'd like to make a donation, all you've got to do is nip onto our website. You'll find the PayPal and Bitcoin links on the front page of the retrohour.com. Now, speaking of spending money, I bought a game this week.
I'm jealous. You sent a picture out on Instagram.
I did.
Little Nintendo Switch there with Sonic Mania on it, and I'm sitting there, PC version ordered.
Now, obviously, Sonic Mania. I think we covered this in like our first or second podcast that we did.
Yeah, because as everybody knows, there's 2 Sonic games coming out at the moment, and one's by Team Sonic, who, they've not been so good recently, and one's by this amazing fan group, and it's getting released on kind of all the major consoles. And that's Sonic Mania, and it's just really like a continuation after Sonic and Knuckles, really. So it's like they've skipped the whole of Sonic Adventure, they've skipped all of this, and they've just gone to Sonic 4.
It's as if the last 20 years never happened.
Yeah,
really?
Just ignore it all.
Now, this did come out at long last on the consoles on Tuesday. So it came out on Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PS4. As a PC gamer, it got delayed a bit, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, and I've ordered the collector's edition, which is quite expensive, but comes with some cool stuff, and that's delayed a lot, yeah.
What do you get with that?
Collector's edition, you get some crazy stuff. You get like a kind of cart that you can pull out that has a big Sonic ring in it. There's also, it's like a Mega Drive, a full Mega Drive, but it's actually bigger than a Mega Drive, with Sonic standing on the top, a big Sonic statue. But all it does is go Sega when you click on. Right. So it's just like a hollow box, basically. But I was thinking, cut out the back, Raspberry Pi inside, light in Sonic's bum, and then you're ready to go.
Is there nothing you haven't shoved a Raspberry Pi in?
No.
So the game itself, I mean, have you seen much of it?
Yeah, I've watched a couple of reviews. I haven't played it myself, but Time Twisted was kind of a bit like it. It's made by the same people.
Well, when you start playing it, this is what you get.
Oh, nice.
Now, I did, start the game. It's got this great introduction animation. I played it on my Switch in handheld mode, lying on the couch. Only managed to play about 10 minutes of it, unfortunately, last night, because we had other stuff on. But I've got to say, the minute the game started, you get introduced to the storyline with, like, a really nice animation.
Oh, I've seen that, because it's been all over YouTube, the Yeah, that looks really old school. It's
Yeah.
like the Sonic cartoons.
Yeah, which is cool. Anyway, and then the game starts, and again, like, a lot of Sonic games, you plonk straight into Green Hill Zone.
Yeah.
Like, it started, now it's a bit like, at first I was like, I've waited a long time for this game, and, they must have put this in about like 40 Sonic games now. I'm like, really, I've got to play Green Hill Zone again? But it changes really quickly.
That's it, because I saw a review of it, and there was a guy like going through Green Hill Zone, and he got a power up, and I was like, I've never seen that power up before. And then suddenly everything he went on fire.
Yeah.
And then like another one, everything he hit, he just smashed through walls.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, this is amazing. It brings such a new dimension to it.
Even some of the bonus levels, like, the 3D kind of running ones, they look really good on it as well. And they've got some new twist to them as well. But I actually think it's a really cool concept because, like me, you kind of get lulled into a bit of a false sense of security. Like, oh, here we go again, playing Green Hill Zone. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, whoa, what's happening here? You know what I mean? It's like, it catches you a bit off guard. And actually, I had loads of fun playing it. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it even more this weekend. But I've got to say, I did actually like Sonic 4. I had that on the Ouya quite randomly. I thought that was good, but I think just having the original kind of graphics and the music, like the, that Chemical Plant Zone music, as soon as you hear that, it just transports you back, doesn't it?
It does seem like a really well thought out game, and everyone, and even some of the harshest reviewers on YouTube that usually slate stuff like this, it's not keeping with the original, right? They loved it. So, I think it's going to go down very well.
And it's not just like a Mega Drive game kind of, ported to a modern system. There is stuff in there where you look at it and you're like, all right, a Mega Drive couldn't have handled this. Even then you'll go to the next level and
Who thought that the main new Sonic game that's, removed all this history and everything has just been a continuation of Sonic and Knuckles would have been on a Nintendo console.
Well, it's nuts, isn't it, that, they've tried so hard and they've done so many things wrong with Sonic as a franchise over the last 2 decades.
I'm not interested in talking Sonic or Sonic has a girlfriend, what? It's not what I play it for.
But then, they finally listened to the fans and they've gone back to roots and everyone's loving it.
Yeah, totally. I think it was that whole mess up with the Saturn and with the Dreamcast and, how they kind of didn't release these good launch titles and weren't consistent with Sonic. But also Sega weren't consistent generally at that time. So.
Well, even like, the headcanon guys and all that, they're obviously, they did this as a labour of love as well.
Yeah.
And, it really shows as well. Anyone who loved those games back in the day, you're not going to be disappointed.
Definitely.
And like 15 quid as well, wasn't it?
Wow, that's a good price.
And
not the collector's edition.
Yeah, yours are probably a bit more.
About 70.
I would like it on physical on the Switch, though. I know it's just a little cartridge you put in the top, but it'd be nice to have the box.
Yeah.
I bet there will be some like homemade ones on eBay as an come up, no doubt.
Some dodgy conversions.
Well, actually, speaking of that opening animation, someone's actually ported that back to the Mega CD.
Oh, of course they have.
Now, it's a guy on YouTube. He's called the Stone Banana. They haven't got the talking and all that in it, but what he's done is kind of like down-resed it to that original kind of low-fidelity movie format that was on the Mega CD. Kind of put the border around there, and he's actually swapped out the Sonic CD logo for the Sonic Mania logo as well. A lot of people in the comments were very cynical, saying all you've done is kind of downgraded the colours, and the Mega Drive couldn't show these many colours in the game. But then he actually posted some proof that this is running on the Mega CD itself. So if fans could maybe port their game back to the Mega CD,
the
that'd
original
be
system, that would be amazing.
That'd be cool. So as it is, though, I actually bought a Nintendo Switch mainly just to play this game on holiday.
Yeah, and it shows the demand's there,
Yeah. Fortunately, my holiday's been and gone now, but I have to book another one now, won't I?
Well, also, talking of demand, we covered Night Trap last week.
Yeah.
And the copies sold out straight away, didn't they? The PS4 ones. There was a limited print and hardly anyone could get it. I came looking after the podcast and I was like, oh, let's look at the social media accounts. I want Night Trap. It was crazy.
It's mad how much interest retro is getting all of a sudden, isn't it?
Yeah, crazy.
So, maybe some people have stumbled across this show because of the Night Trap episode last week and you're like, oh, I'd like to find out a bit more about old games. And you are in the right place.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I keep saying definitely.
It's good to be affirmative, really, isn't it? Now, something that is kind of missing from our high streets, you walk around town these days. What was different 20 years ago? Obviously, you had the shops that were there on the high street that are not there today. Our Price Records are long gone.
You had those little stands with guys going, Evening Post. That was around our area. Newspaper sellers shouting.
Rumbelows on the high street, do you remember that?
Yeah.
What about payphones?
Payphones, yeah. I remember payphones when they turned into text and email phones as well, and you could go to the payphone and actually text from there. And
yeah, that was like about 10 years ago. They tried to reinvent them with that, didn't they?
Yeah.
Or maybe a little bit longer ago. But it now turns out that BT are finally admitting defeat. And they're set to scrap half of the UK's remaining payphone boxes, but because apparently usage has fallen on them 90%. So they're going to get rid of 20,000 payphones across the UK.
I can see why. The only places I've seen payphones recently have been dodgy areas and people doing deals within them and stuff. That's the only place I've seen them. I've seen a few specialist disabled payphones which are actually halfway down, but I'm not sure why they're required if people have mobile phones, and especially charger packs and stuff like that.
Well, they reckon that a third of payphones that do still exist in the UK are only used once a month, and many are not used at all throughout a year. You know, some of them haven't been used for like a year long.
Wow.
But the ones that are in more regular use, apparently 33,000 phone calls a day still made from phone boxes.
Oh, okay. So sorry if I'm offending any payphone users. You're not all drug dealers.
Payphone enthusiasts.
Yeah.
And the ones around me are generally used as public toilets, I think, when I go past them. But, I mean, I can see there are probably use cases for them, you know, places like train stations, for example. If you're on the train, your phone battery's died.
Places with no signal, actually. There's still a lot of places in the UK, actually, that don't have signal. My parents went out recently to the Lake District.
Yeah.
And couldn't get in communication for days. They were like, you just have to ring us when we're at the hostel. I was like, what? What is this, the 80s?
Well, from what I've seen recently as well, a lot of the ones that do still exist have kind of repurposed them as kind of joint phones and ATMs as well.
Well, have you seen the one in town?
What's that one?
It's a hipster coffee shop.
In a phone box?
In a phone box. He's got a barista at the top, a fridge at the bottom. He opens it. It's got his menu. And actually, there was a homeless guy sleeping in there before, so right. I don't know if the hipsters kicked him out.
It might be him. He might just have a shave.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Saved up for a coffee machine.
So, I mean, the decline of payphones is inevitable now that everyone's got a mobile phone on their hands, but I can see why they're doing it as well, because apparently they're spending more money on doing them up after vandalism than they are like making money off them. So it's something that's kind of a sign of the times, really, isn't it? But when you do walk past a phone box and look at it and you see the old like kind of BT logo, there is something a bit nostalgic about it.
Yeah, and I think they keep the red ones alive.
Yeah.
They constantly maintain the red ones because they're just iconic now, aren't they? So.
And again, they're turning those into kind of different kind of
stores.
That's
one of the
stuff,
hipsters ones is a red one. Yeah.
I always remember when we were kids, we'd like go to my friend's house and he had a phone box outside and we'd ring the phone box to see who pick it up.
Yeah.
That was always fun. You could do that really easily. That'd be a great.
Or you could just ring someone and have the beep, beep and go, I'm running out of money, and they'd get really confused.
Or you could do 141 reverse the charges.
Are you calling off a payphone?
Yeah. So yeah, make the most of them while you can. But yeah, I mean, looking at the picture on this article in The Guardian, I wouldn't want to use that payphone. No. Looks a bit grotty, got to say. Now, the Nintendo 64 controller. Now, remember we were talking, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, about the fact that Nintendo have done a patent for like an updated N64 controller.
Yeah.
And we were wondering, is this going to be like an N64 Mini? Or maybe, you know, it's going to be a re-release controller for the Switch maybe to play N64 games off the virtual arcade? Well, it turns out somebody else is actually making a new Nintendo 64 controller for the original system.
Oh, cool. Oh, and they've replaced the Z triggers.
This looks totally different, doesn't it, to the original?
Yeah, because the main one had that weird prong in the middle, and you could hold it like a gun and kind of shoot with it, couldn't you?
Well, there's about 3 different ways of holding the original. And the original controller was... Mario 64 was the main game that controller was designed for. And then other developers had to kind of work their game around that control mechanism. But a lot of people hate it. And the N64 is a great console, but I do know people who are just awful on the games on the N64 simply because of that controller. So now it turns out there's a Kickstarter running to make a functional, modern N64 controller, getting rid of that 3-prong design, making it comfortable, and looking at it, I mean, it kind of does take quite a lot of inspiration from, you know, stuff like the Xbox 360 controller and the Switch Pro controller, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say the Switch Pro or the Wii U Pro as well. I think they're the same controllers, but it's got more of a kind of a straight edge design on it. You know, it's not all smoothed and rounded. It's got like a few straight sections on it. And
you got the analog stick that's more like a thumbstick that you get in modern controllers. You've got a D-pad on there as well.
And the Z triggers are at the back.
Yeah.
Like not underneath it, you know.
So it does look a lot more comfortable to hold. Its worth has been proved by the Kickstarter. Now, they put this on there on a 30-day Kickstarter. They wanted to raise $13,000. And already at the time of recording this, they've raised $116,000.
Wow. I already knew about this because I was on Kickstarter and people I'm following started backing that project. And it's like, oh, what is this?
Straight away, yeah. It's only been going 8 days at the time of recording this, and they've already, made 116,000. So this is obviously something that people have wanted for a long time. But I didn't realise quite how many people really hated the N64 controller.
Surely there were some third-party ones out at the time. Maybe they didn't, they weren't up to scratch.
Well, what's really good is, they're actually selling these for $20 each to the backers.
Oh, cool.
So
wow.
You look at this, the Switch Pro controller, and that's like 59 quid.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so you
I
see,
hope the build quality is good.
it looks it from, obviously it's just a video, and, I'm not sure whether these are renders or whether they're actual photographs. It looks pretty good, I've got to say, if they are, but it looks like it should be a good, solid controller. Obviously, we can't tell until you get it in your hands. It's always very subjective, but for the sake of 20 quid, even just to get something a bit different, for people who maybe are just getting into the N64, it's probably good as well. And if you've got a friend coming over and he's like, oh, I've never really played it before, then it's good to put them on this instead.
Do you think they'll be compatible with the mini N64 that comes out? Ooh.
Yeah, well, it's got the original ports, you'd imagine it would be, but, that obviously hasn't been
There might be some strange converters or something.
Hasn't been confirmed yet, though, has it, Ravi? Don't get ahead of yourself.
No, sorry. I'm getting too excited.
Getting overexcited about all these minis everywhere.
Vapor. It could be vapor.
I'm sure it'll happen. So we'll put that link to the Kickstarter if you're doing a back that and get yourself one of those for $20. That's not bad. We'll put that in this week's show notes at theretrohour.com. Right then, well, thank you for checking out episode number 84 of the Retro Hour podcast. The next episode will, of course, be coming out next Friday, just before the weekend, available from all of your favourite podcast clients.
And we're going to bring you another controversial game.
Yeah, next week should be a good one, shouldn't it?
Probably the most controversial game ever released. Other than Manhunt, yeah.
We'll try and keep the that explicit tag off our ratings on iTunes. Yeah, we'll keep our guest in check next week. But now, though, a family-friendly character on this week's show.
Oh, yes. The lover, not a fighter. We've got Qbert.
This week's special guest, Warren Davis, the man behind Qbert. And we'll see you next Friday.
Ciao.
You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. Welcome to the show, Warren Davis.
Hello.
How are you, Warren?
I am doing very well, thank you, and greetings from across the pond.
To think the things we can do with modern technology.
It's true.
But on this chat, we're obviously going to go back in the day, way back to, those dark ages of video games when it all first began. But I thought it might be quite interesting to find out a little bit about your backstory, where it all started for you. I mean, do you remember your first ever experience with a computer then, where it all began?
I do. I was introduced to computers in high school, which was kind of an unusual thing back then, because computers generally, there was no such thing as a personal computer when I was a child. Computers were large things that took up rooms, and usually at major corporations or universities. But when I was in high school, I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that had their own computer. It was a desk-sized computer. It looked like a desk. It was L-shaped. It had a typewriter sitting on this desk as the input and output, and so you would type stuff in on the typewriter, and it would type stuff back to you. It was a pretty cool thing. I was fascinated by computers as a child. You'd see them in movies, mostly science fiction movies, and they just seemed like fascinating things. So, and I also had a sort of a mathematical mind as a child too. Math was one of my best subjects, and so that lent itself to logic and programming, and I just started getting into it in high school.
So you went on obviously to do engineering, is that right, at college?
Correct. Yes. So when it was time to pick a field of study for college, there were really two things I wanted to pursue. One was computers. I wanted to learn how to build them, basically, and the other was filmmaking, because I was a Super 8 amateur filmmaker in my teens, and I really enjoyed that as well. I was fascinated by filmmaking. For me, it was a 50-50. I would have been happy either way. Of course, everybody steered me towards computers because filmmaking didn't seem like a proper career for for success in life. But I was happy to study computers, and that's the direction I went.
Were you ever into kind of stop motion and stuff like that early, playing around with film techniques?
I was. I had a Super 8 camera that had a stop motion ability. It had a frame release, so you could literally screw in a little cable release and take one frame at a time. And I did used to play around with stop motion animation. Loved the results I got. It was so much fun. And I had a friend who was really talented as a stop motion animator. He built like little dinosaurs in a little set, and he made he made a dinosaur movie that just looked fantastic for somebody who was, probably about 14 years old at the time.
Well, obviously, when we got into the late 70s, we had the the first arcade revolution started. I mean, do you remember seeing your first video game?
I do, actually. I was in college. I was a freshman in college, and at my college they had a game room in the student union, which was mostly filled with ping pong tables, pool tables, and then there was a small area for arcade games, which at that time meant pinball machines. And maybe some mechanical, like there was a mechanical baseball game. I don't know if you remember those, where, looked like a baseball field and you'd hit a bat. Of course, I guess they wouldn't have had those in England, but here they
cricket
had
pitch.
mechanical games.
Cricket, yeah.
Did they have mechanical cricket games?
We had kind of horse racing ones. So, everybody would bet on the horses, and then you'd have a big line, and it would be at the seaside, and they'd kind of race across the track.
Sure. Okay, I remember things like that. Yeah, so, but that's what they had. And then I remember them wheeling in this strange-looking machine that no one had ever seen before, and it was a video game. And I'm pretty sure it was either Computer Space or Space Wars, one of those two. The crudest possible simple graphics, little dots on the screen, but it was absolutely fascinating because your mind filled in the gaps. You had a goal, and you knew what you had to do as far as gameplay, and it was challenging. In my student union, that one game was followed by Pong, and then followed by Tank, Breakout, Scramble, all those early games. Space Invaders, I think, came out in the late 70s. I was probably out of college when Space Invaders came out. So, I played all of those games. And I would say, I as a guy who studied computers, I sort of dreamed of being able to make these games. I thought this would be the most amazing dream job possible. I should also say that my whole interest in computers, or at least in the use of computers, was related to entertainment. I mean, I just felt computers were a perfect tool for, having a laugh with people. When video games came out, I was like, man, how do I get that job? And I honestly didn't know how to get that job. I just assumed you had to be really special. You had to be some sort of genius or know the right people, and I did not know the right people. So it was just a pipe dream for me.
So after college, you got a job at Bell Labs.
So at Bell Labs, I was hired. So it was okay. This is kind of funny, but my studies were sort of integrating hardware and software, which was kind of unusual at the time. Mostly, you either studied hardware and got a EE, electrical engineering degree, or you studied software and got a computer science degree. But I was in one of the first, actually I think it was the second year that this discipline was offered. It's called Computer and Systems Engineering, which was supposed to be sort of a hardware and software thing. I guess the world was just sort of coming around to realizing that hardware and software are sort of interrelated. Anyway, I was looking for a job that did not force me to pick between hardware or software. And that's what this job at Bell Labs promised to be. Unfortunately, when I moved out to the suburbs of Illinois, which is where this job was located, it turned out to be neither hardware nor software. I ended up writing tests for new operator systems. So basically the consoles that the operators would sit at when back in the old days when you used to dial O for operator, you would actually reach a person sitting at a console. And I worked for the group at Bell Labs that basically wrote the software that ran these consoles. And so basically I wasn't doing any software development or hardware development. I was just writing tests. And it was kind of interesting in that they'd send me to some city where I'd live for maybe 5 or 6 months. And then we'd be put up in some office somewhere, usually a telephone company office, that was going to be the guinea pig for this new version of the software. And we would just run our tests. We'd spend a few months writing them, then we'd spend a few months running them. And then when we were done, they would say, okay, here it is, it's working. And we would come back to suburban Illinois and work on the next one.
How did you get into the process of kind of making video games then?
So what happened was I found this job at Bell Labs somewhat dissatisfying for a number of reasons. One, I wasn't doing actual hardware or software development. And two, they were sending me to cities where I was actually enjoying myself. I was a single guy at the time, and I was sort of, learning my way, making friends. And then after 5 or 6 months, it'd be like, okay, you have to leave now. And I was like, but wait a minute, I like it here. So I was kind of getting tired of that lifestyle. And Bell Labs did put me on an actual development project. It was considered an R&D project, and I was actually working with a speech recognition group. Speech recognition being in its very early infancy back then. But we were working on speaker-independent voice recognition for digits only. Mm-hmm. And I was doing some hardware development for that group, which I enjoyed tremendously, but I was only on loan. So they kept pulling me back into the testing group. After a few years, I got tired of that, and I decided I think I can do better. So I quit my job at Bell Labs, and I moved into Chicago. And that was a whole nother decision, because I kind of, when I left Bell Labs, was fed up with engineering. I just started to think, I'm not right for engineering. I don't fit in. I'm not like the rest of these guys. And I had seen some improv shows in Chicago at the Second City, and I thought, that looks like fun. I think I could do that. So I moved into Chicago and started taking classes at the Second City to learn how to be an improv performer. And I was unemployed for a few months. And after about 4 months of being unemployed, and of course the money I had saved up from working at Bell Labs was dwindling, and I had taken some odd jobs that didn't really last very long. And I thought, it wouldn't hurt if I just looked in the Sunday paper and looked at the want ads and saw what engineering jobs were available. I hated myself for doing it, but I thought it's not going to hurt. So I would check the Sunday paper, and lo and behold, one fateful Sunday, actually the Sunday between Christmas and New Year's in 1981, I saw an ad where a company called D. Gottlieb was looking for video game programmers. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that. And the amazing thing is, I actually thought twice about it. I was like, no, Warren, you said you were getting out of engineering and it's going to be back in the same old, And then I thought, well, look, it doesn't hurt to send a letter and a resume. So that's what I did. I got an answer back within days, very quickly. They asked me to come in for an interview, and right after New Year's, I went in for an interview. That interview made me think I was never going to get this job. The interview did not seem to go well. The VP of engineering just seemed to have nothing but contempt for me. But then, lo and behold, they offered me a job. So there I was.
Well, do you have any programming experience or game design background or anything at this point then?
I had no experience making video games. Mm-hmm. I had virtually no experience with computer graphics, even though all during my undergraduate and graduate time, I desperately wanted to learn about computer graphics. I just didn't really have too many opportunities to do anything. I did have a master's degree in electrical engineering. I did understand computers and software. And I had a burning interest in making video games, but when they asked me about my experience, I had to be completely honest. I said, look, I don't know if I can make a video game or not. I've never done it. I just want the opportunity. Apparently, they realized at that time, because Gottlieb was very new to video games then, they didn't have any video games that were produced in-house at the time that had gone out the door. And so I think they realized that they're hiring people, there really were no video game experts back then, or I should say there were very few video game experts in January of 1982. Gottlieb had hired a guy named Tim Skelly, who was one of the few video game experts because he had a string of hits for Cinematronics. Ripoff, that's another one of his. Anyway, so Tim Skelly was hired to sort of be the guru to help lead our fledgling team of inexperienced programmers to make some games.
I mean, Gottlieb, originally, they were a pinball company, weren't they? And I mean, when you guys started doing video games, was there ever a bit of a conflict between the pinball guys and the video game guys?
Well, yeah, it didn't last long. And basically, the history of it is that Gottlieb was a pinball company, as were Stern and Williams and Bally. And they all got into video games. Gottlieb was, I think, the last of them to get into video games. I think all those other pinball companies sort of jumped on video games much earlier than Gottlieb. The video department was completely separate from the pinball department. The video department was led by Ron Waxman. He was the VP of engineering, and Howie Rubin was the VP of business development. And these two guys are the guys who built the video department at Gottlieb. But we were given a separate space. We were actually probably about 8 miles away from the from the main plant in Northlake. We were in Bensonville, and we had complete freedom and autonomy, and Howie and Ron were great at sort of protecting us from the rest of the company. So we really didn't have much of a sense of what the rest of the company was doing. We never were introduced to anybody else, or we never visited the main plant. And then about midway through the year 1982, I was actually in the middle of development on what would become Qbert. We were moved from Bensonville to Northlake. They decided, I guess, they didn't want us separate, and they brought us in. And they didn't tell the pinball guys anything. They didn't tell us anything. They didn't arrange for any sort of meet and greet or mixer or anything. We just showed up one day in a new space, and we were actually kind of excited because I think a lot of us in the video department were pinball players. We really admired these pinball designers, and we were kind of excited to meet them. And when we got there, we just kind of got the stink eye. You know, everybody, people were giving us these looks and glaring at us. What we didn't know is that a lot of these pinball guys wanted the opportunity to do video games, and they were not given that. The company just didn't give them that opportunity. So there was a little animosity that we weren't aware of, but it all took care of itself. I mean, once they got to know us, they realized that we weren't the bad guys, and we understood where they were coming from. So it really did all work itself out.
So let's talk about Qbert then. Obviously, what an iconic game, and a very interesting concept as well. I mean, how did you first come up with this concept of an isometric game?
Well, I mean, it didn't start with a concept. That's the one thing about Qbert. It was an evolutionary game. It was literally one piece at a time, and every time one piece got done and was working, then I would say, oh, okay, what should I do next? And I really never looked beyond the next thing, because it was my first game that I was working on by myself. It was the first game that I was basically the sole programmer of it. I just didn't want to complicate things, and I didn't want to extend beyond my abilities. So it started out as a learning exercise, a programming exercise for me. What happened was Jeff Lee, who's a graphic artist and amazingly talented guy, had come up with this sort of Escher-like pattern of cubes that filled the screen. And this is a pattern, I have to say it's really weird, but I've been seeing this pattern everywhere I look lately. Seriously, I mean, I saw it on a tie, I saw it on and not the pyramid, okay? Just again, it's just sort of like a never-ending pattern of these cubes. Mm-hmm. I saw it at the Getty Villa here in Los Angeles, and the Getty Villa is modeled after an actual Roman villa, and they showed a film at the Getty Villa of the actual Roman villa, and it had this pattern in it, in this actual Roman villa. So the pattern is not new. The pattern's been around for thousands of years. So anyway, Jeff Lee had created this sort of cube pattern, and Kan Yabamoto, another programmer, was using it as the background, again, just filling the screen. But when I was walking by one day and I looked at his screen, I saw this cube pattern, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. If it was shaped like a pyramid, right, and something fell on the top, like a ball, for example, dropped on it, it would have one of two choices of which way to bounce. And of course, as a programmer, you like the idea of two choices. That's 0 and 1, which is a bit. And if you put 8 bits together, you get a byte. So every time a ball would fall on this pyramid, it would have one of two choices, and with 1 byte, you could determine the entire path of a ball. So with a string of random bytes, you could have a string of random paths. And you know, I had never programmed randomness, and I had never programmed gravity. So I thought, all right, this is a good exercise. So I set about molding these background blocks into a pyramid shape that was just sort of floating on the screen. And I asked Jeff Lee to give me a ball that would bounce, that I could make bounce. And I programmed a ball bouncing down the pyramid. And that's it. That was as far as I had thought it through. But when I got that far, and people would walk by and they'd look at it and they'd go, "Hey, that looks pretty cool." So okay, well, what would be the next thing? The next thing would be to have a player character jumping around. And then, again, that's a challenge. That in itself for me was a challenge. There was gravity elements, there were directional elements. I had never done it before. There was control elements. So I asked Jeff to give me a player character, and Jeff had drawn up all of these crazy-looking characters, and he showed them all to me. I liked the one with the orange oval body and the long nose, and I said, let me use that one. So he drew up all the angles I needed, and then I was off and running trying to get the character jumping around the pyramid.
Was he based on anything then? Was it? He's got like the nose of an anteater. He's a bit of a mishmash, isn't he?
Well, again, you'd have to ask Jeff where it came from. I mean, Jeff's original idea was that this character would shoot out of his nose. So that's why he's designed that way. He was designed, and again, Jeff has a very, comical sense, as I do, and I thought the idea of him shooting out of his nose was a great idea, but it just really complicated things, and I also had no idea how to make that work given the geometry of the pyramid that I wanted to put this character on. Shooting, aiming and all that stuff just seemed to way overcomplicate things. And again, this was my very first time programming a game, and I wanted to keep it simple. But, you'd have to delve into the mind of Jeff Lee to really understand where the design of the character came from. I mean, all the characters in Qbert are very, bizarre and surreal, and that's Jeff.
Well, obviously turning it into a fully fledged game, I mean, having the cubes change colour, did that idea come pretty late in the process then?
That was kind of one of the next two things, because once you had the player character jumping around, then I think the next thing was, well, what about having an enemy chasing him around? And so it's possible coily was the next element. The coily thing was obvious. He needed an enemy, but the cube changing thing was not obvious. And there was one night where I was working late and I was just playing the game, basically having, hopping around this pyramid of cubes, avoiding balls. Actually, that's the next thing I remember. After the player and the balls was the collision detection. Obviously, the player had to avoid the balls, and he had to get killed. So that's as far as I had gotten. And Ron Waxman, our VP of engineering, is a very large man, very large. And he would always smoke a cigar, and he would stay late frequently, and he had a habit of sort of coming into the workroom. We all worked in this sort of like big open room where we had different tables. We didn't even have cubicles. We just had tables. And he had a habit of coming in and just sort of sitting behind you while you worked. And it was very unnerving because you could hear him breathing and smoking a cigar. I mean, he wouldn't say anything most of the time. He would just watch. So you got used to it. But I was playing around and I was having this character jumping around the pyramid, and just out of nowhere he said, "What if the colors on the cubes changed when he landed on them?" Something to that effect. And that struck me as a brilliant idea. I just immediately thought, yeah, that's great, because the one thing that this game had been missing was a goal. Avoiding enemies is one thing, but you really needed a goal or a way to sort of end the screen. And as soon as he said that, I was like, yep, that sounds good. And I set about to implement that, and that's in my mind, that's when it actually became a game.
And it's often the simple ideas that really work the best as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wasn't arrogant enough. This was my first game, and I wasn't arrogant enough to think I knew everything. So I was happy to listen to ideas. The fact is, people were constantly barraging me with ideas. Everybody had an idea of what they wanted to be in the game, what they didn't, what they liked in it, and what they didn't like. And I started to think of myself as the filter. So I would take in all these ideas and I would filter. If somebody gave me something that I thought was a good idea, I would say, "Oh, great, thanks," and I would do it. And if somebody gave me an idea I didn't like, I'd say thanks, but I'm not going to do that. So, shooting out of the nose, obviously, was one thing I did not do. There were plenty of others. And Jeff Lee became sort of my collaborator in that regard because, he had a lot of ideas, some of which were great and some of which I didn't think I could do. And then Dave Thiel came in with the sounds, and he sort of completed the triumvirate there, and so I really feel like the three of us have authorship of the game as a whole.
Well, talking about the sounds, I mean, that was a very interesting choice. Where did Qbert's language or voice come from then?
Well, a lot of it came from a particular chip that was on our soundboard. It was called the Votrax, and it was a voice chip that was supposed to give you human speech. And Dave Thiel had used this chip in doing sounds for other games, pinball games, but it came out with a very monotone, unhuman sounding voice. It was based on phonemes. So basically you had different phonemes for different sounds and you had to string them together in the right order to make a word. But particularly he felt like it was never able to say the word bonus. He felt like whenever he tried to program it to say bonus, it sounded like bogus. And he just hated this chip. He just thought it was terrible. But when he saw Qbert and he saw the game that, running without sounds, his immediate thought was, I could use those those phonemes, if I spewed them out just randomly, it would sound like gibberish. And in fact, it would sound like swearing. And, I think Jeff came up with the idea of having the cartoon balloon, like if you got hit on the head, just like in a cartoon, you have this swearing balloon, right? Mm-hmm. And so when Dave saw that, and he said, I've got the perfect sound for that. So it was all sort of very synergistic.
And what about the name then? Because even the way that the name is stylized with the asterisks, that's quite unusual. Did you have any names that you went through first, and how did you arrive at the final name?
Yeah. So I didn't have any name for the game at all. I called it Cubes. That's I was not I was not interested in naming things. I was more interested in having a game that would be interesting and fun and might actually get out the door. So, but when we got to the end of development and we were talking about putting it out on test, obviously we had to have a name for it. And Howie Rubin, our outside of the box thinking VP of business development, said, let's call it the Swearing Balloon. Let's have the Swearing Balloon be the name of the game. And we all just shook our heads and said, what? I mean, we thought he was insane. And he was, but that's another story. But he said, look, if it's a good enough game, people are going to find, because we would say, what are you going to call it? I mean, how are you going to talk about it? And he said, people will find a way. If it's a good enough game, people will find a way. Well, he went so far as to actually have marquees printed with that cartoon balloon, and they went out on test that way. But eventually we realized this is not going to fly. So we actually had to name it. And I went around the entire office to everybody at Gottlieb, and I asked them for suggestions. And I would write them down. I had a pad of paper that just had, probably about 30 to 50 suggested ideas for names. And I didn't like any of them. I thought they were ridiculous, most of them. And so we had to have a meeting. And there was I feel like there was 10 of us sitting in a conference room talking about what are we going to name this game. And it was very surreal. I remember sitting back and taking myself out of it at one point and saying, what are we doing? We are grown men talking about what to name this character. But I think early on we agreed that the name of the game should be the name of the character. I think we all felt that the character was the selling point. Although I think it was Howie that also came up with the name Why Me. He put forward the name Why Me as the name of the game. So try to imagine Qbert being called Why Me. Anyway, as we pursued the name of the character, at one point in this meeting, somebody got up and wrote on the blackboard or whiteboard, whatever it was, Qbert, the name Qbert, H-U-B-E-R-T. And they just thought, okay, it's kind of a cute name for a character. It's a silly name, whatever. And then somebody else kind of realized there was an opportunity there, and they said, wait a minute, the game's about cubes. Why don't we call it Qbert with a C? So we replaced the H with a C. Now it said C-U-B-E-R-T. And everybody's starting to get really interested here. You could sort of feel it in the room. There was just a kind of a buzz. And everybody was like, yeah, Qbert. And then somebody else went over and said, okay, wait. And they took away the C-U and they put the letter Q. Okay, what about Qbert, right? And I think they put a little dash in there. And Jeff Lee went up and he changed the dash into an asterisk. And we were like, yes. And everybody's jumping up and down, screaming. Okay, maybe that didn't happen. Maybe that was in my mind. But literally everybody was just in agreement. That's it. And we all knew it at the same time. It was amazing.
The rumor that it was called Snots and Boogers is not true then?
Snots and Boogers was put forth as a joke. I do not ever recall anybody seriously taking Snots and Boogers as a serious idea. It was a joke, It was like somebody said, hey, he should shoot out of his nose and we should call it Snots and Boogers, and everybody laughed. My recollection is that was the extent of it.
The 8-year-old child in me would have loved that, though, I'm sure.
Exactly. Listen, if we thought we could get away with it, maybe we would have called it that. And if he actually did shoot out of his nose, honestly, Snots and Boogers is kind of a pun on Chutes and Ladders. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So that was the gag. It was supposed to sound like a children's game.
Well, something really innovative about the arcade cabinet. It actually had a knocker in there. What was that, and how did it work then?
Well, the knocker was a standard pinball knocker. They go into pinball games, and they're little cylinders, little pistons, if you will, activated by an electrical signal, and they just shoot out and they knock the side of the cabinet. And what happened was one of our engineering techs, a guy named Rick Ty, he suggested, after watching the game and playing, he said, because Qbert falls off the pyramid, he falls. Where is he falling to? He said, wouldn't it be cool if we put a knocker down at the bottom of the cabinet? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, it sounds like it'd be cool, but, the knock, if it sounds like a knock, like you're knocking on a door, it's not really the sound of a body falling. I was like, I would like it to sound like a sack of potatoes hitting the ground after a fall. So we put the knocker in and we just tried it out. And what we did was we put a little piece of foam on the cabinet where the piston hits. And it softened the sound just enough for it to sound like a sack of potatoes, like a thud. And I loved it. I thought it was a fantastic idea. So we went to management. We said, hey, we want to do this. And they were like, well, we can do the piston, but the foam is going to cost us $15 per cabinet in labor cost. And we don't want to do that. So they nixed the foam and they put in the knocker, and the rest is history. A lot of people love that feature, but unfortunately, I am aware of how much better it could have been, and so I have mixed feelings about it.
So what was the result of the original testing of Qbert? It
actually tested pretty well. I mean, my biggest fear was that people would not come back to it after dying. A lot of people at Gottlieb did not like the idea of jumping off the pyramid to your death. They thought you should be locked onto the pyramid. I felt otherwise. I felt like that was a challenge that was not, out of the realm, of reasonableness. So I felt like there's nothing wrong with having to learn to stay on the pyramid. But a lot of people felt like, players would jump off the pyramid and die. And in fact, when it went out on test for the first time, a lot of people did. They would be sitting there on top of the pyramid, they'd push their joystick, they'd fall off and die 3 times in a row, lose their quarter, and walk away. So I did start to worry a little bit, but I also saw those same people come back. Eventually, they would master it, and other people who maybe didn't master it would watch people playing and realize how to avoid jumping off the pyramid, and however it happened, people kept coming back to it, and that was the key. And when that happened, I knew that we at least had something that had a shot. That I felt the basic concept will work, and the basic gameplay will work, and then it became about tuning. Most people, when we were doing in-house play testing, that's the first play testing you always do, is just the people in your office playing it. They kept encouraging me to make it easier. They felt it was too hard. And when it was new in the on test in the arcades, and I would watch people playing it, I thought, okay, I can make it easier at the beginning. So I kept sort of tuning it, scaling it back, making it easier. And we did some focus group testing, and always came back the same. It's just too hard. And so when it went out the door, it didn't take long for us to get reports of people playing it for hours and hours on end. And I realized almost immediately I'd made it too easy. And that was just my inexperience of never having made a game, never having tuned a game, and really not knowing how good those players are out in the field. They're way better than the random people you're going to encounter either at work or in 1 or 2 arcades or in a focus group. So anyway, that led to my continuing work on tuning and creating this version called Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert that never got released. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself.
I love the name of that, though, as well. It wasn't like Qbert 2 or anything. It was...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I thought of that. Qbert 2, Super Qbert. I mean, those are the obvious things. And I was like, I don't want to do that. And so what I found was every time anybody asked me, well, so what's different about this game? I would end up saying, well, it's faster, it's harder, and it's more challenging. And so... There it was. There was the name right there.
So why did that never get a release properly?
Well, we did test it, but the thing is, I did this almost immediately after Qbert got released, and it took months for Qbert's, the cabinets we built, to sort of get spread out into the world and for people to start playing them. So even though we started producing them, I think in like October, November of 1982. You really don't see a lot of press about Qbert until 1983, like probably spring of 1983 is when it became a phenomenon. And that's just because, it took time to build these games, get them out into the arcades, people to discover them. But I had already done Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert like almost instantly after I was done with the original. And it was too soon. So it was going out in arcades, and people were still playing and liking the original, and this faster one was too fast, too hard, too challenging for the average player. My feeling is if we had waited a year, and then put it out, I think it would have done a lot better. I don't know why they didn't do that. I to this day, I have no idea. I mean, it certainly wasn't ready when I originally did it, and I understood that. But why we didn't revisit it a year later, I do not know.
What was it like for you then, like your first game suddenly blowing up to become this phenomenon?
Oh, it was bizarre and surreal. I certainly was gratified that people liked it. It made my life easy. I didn't make any money off of it, really, because as any engineer would, when you work for a company, you sign a piece of paper that says anything you develop is owned by the company. So really what I got out of it was bragging rights. And unfortunately, I couldn't even use those bragging rights because Gottlieb was so protective of its designers that they would not give us any credit. Like, we weren't allowed to put our names in the game. We weren't allowed... When Video Games Magazine did that article, they were not even allowed to refer to us by name in the article. We had pseudonyms. So my pseudonym was D. Ziner. The letter D, Ziner. And then Jeff's pseudonym was R. Teast, and Dave's pseudonym was J. Walkman. Most people at that time didn't care who designed a game. You know, they played a game in the arcades and never thought about where did it come from. So there really wasn't much interest in the people behind the game, other than in the industry. So it's sort of, Qbert helped me anytime I wanted to get a job in the video games industry. It was certainly a nice calling card.
Well, Qbert was obviously ported to a lot of systems, I think 17 home consoles in the end and computers. Did you have any quality control over the ports at all?
I did not. That was done by other people. I did talk to some of those guys. I did write up something that I think got distributed to all of them about sort of like level progressions and just sort of nuts and bolts things of the game. And then I talked to a few of them on the phone, I remember. I don't remember which ones, but I did have some phone conversations. But other than that, yeah, I had nothing to do with any of those home versions.
Did you play any of them, and any ones that you liked or any ones that you didn't rate?
The one I think I liked the best was the Colecovision. I just liked the Colecovision system. You know, there was we arcade developers had a little bit of an attitude about home games. You know, like we felt like we were the Cadillacs. You know. And those guys were the Volkswagens. You know, we actually had the best graphics. You know, a lot of those home systems had terrible graphics. I mean, nowadays I appreciate that these guys had to work under really difficult circumstances, and I admire what they had to do. But, you know, back then it was like, you know, I kind of dismissed a lot of the home games, but Colecovision to me came closest to looking and playing like the arcade version, and you know, that was of course important to me. And it was like little things too, you know, sometimes the home versions, like I built in a little knee bounce. Like when Qbert jumps and he lands, there's like a little shock absorber frame where his legs contract a little bit. A lot of people left that out, and to me, you know, I was like, oh, but that's so important. I know it's stupid, but to me that was important.
Well, as a player as well, I mean, you know, back in the 80s, you're right, I mean, a lot of the ports from the arcade to home systems were often quite disappointing because just technically the systems weren't anywhere near the level of the arcade hardware, so these guys did have a big job, I guess, to get them as near as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would look at, like, let's say the Atari 2600 version of Qbert, and I would just be, like, horrified. But, you know, it's a business, and you want to get your product out there, and having versions for every possible home system was part of that. Not to mention the merchandising. I mean, Qbert was so ridiculously merchandised, that was also mind-blowing for me to see, you know.
Well, it even got made into a cartoon, didn't they?
Yeah, Saturday morning cartoon. We that's another thing we had absolutely nothing to do with. I think, you know, Gottlieb just sort of, you know, licensed the character to a company to make that, and they ran with it, and, you know, we would just look at it and go, what the hell did they do? But, hey, it's out of our hands, you know. We really did not have any ownership of what happened to Qbert.
So you didn't get any royalties from the cartoons or the merchandise?
I got royalties from nothing. The only thing I did get, Gottlieb did give me a bonus. It was a fairly modest bonus, and which, believe me, I was grateful for because it was my first game. I was grateful just for the opportunity to be working in the industry. But that bonus, you know, was a down payment on a condo in Chicago. So, you know, that really helped me out when I was starting. And then Gottlieb, after Mach 3, which was a very successful Laserdisc game for Gottlieb, they actually did institute a royalty program. And I remember the meeting, they called everybody together to announce this new royalty program, and they used Qbert as an example, and they said, so if Qbert had been done under this royalty program, which is not retroactive, by the way, so Qbert is not eligible for the royalties, but if Qbert had been done, Warren would have made $100,000.
But that was nice to hear.
I was like, oh, yes, thank you so much. Yeah, that did not make me feel good. But, and as far as I know, you know, because Gottlieb folded its doors shortly after that, I mean, Mach 3 wasn't the last game they released. They did release some other games, but I don't think any of them sold enough to qualify for the royalty program.
Because they were owned by a few very big companies, weren't they? Columbia Pictures, even Coca-Cola owned them at one point, didn't they?
Well, here's the way it worked. Gottlieb, of course, a family-owned business until about 1977, and they were bought by Columbia Pictures. Now, they stayed owned by Columbia Pictures until they were closed. And a lot of people seem to get this wrong, but Gottlieb changed their name at one point to Milestar. That literally was all that happened. It was just a name change. Nothing in the company changed other than that. A lot of people think that Gottlieb was bought by Milestar or that Milestar was some other company. Not true. That was literally just a name change. Columbia Pictures, still the parent company. What happened was Coca-Cola bought Columbia Pictures. So Coca-Cola became our parent one more step removed. And then they started sort of, I'm not entirely sure how this went down, but my feeling or my understanding is that Columbia did not like the ups and downs of the video game industry, and they're the ones that really sort of pushed to get rid of or to close the company down. And that's what happened in 1984. Gottlieb got shut down.
So is that when you left?
Well, everybody left. The company was literally shut down. We walked into work one day, and Ron Waxman shouted out to the entire area, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are closed." And, we had to gather our things. We stuck around long enough to have meetings with some severance specialists who told us about our severance packages. And then we were literally out of there forever.
I know there's a lot of that happening in the video games industry at the time, obviously, but that must have come as a bit of a shock. You must have felt a bit like the rug had been pulled out from under your feet.
In some ways it was a shock. In some other ways it was a relief, because there was a sense in the company that things were not going well. And it's really hard to describe, because some of it was just the fact that the environment had changed. We had hired sort of a middle manager to crack the whip on a lot of the programmers. I mean, Howie and Ron's method of just sort of letting everybody do whatever they wanted worked out great for like Mach 3 and for Qbert, but then they hired a bunch of people who just basically were not delivering. Some of the people. Obviously, there were other games that went out the door, Mad Planets and Krull, and other people were working on games, but they had hired a few people who just sort of weren't pulling their weight, and they hired a middle manager to crack the whip, and then suddenly the environment, it just became a little bit less fun and a little bit more like work. So that was one thing that changed. But then also there was just a sense of some foreboding, little people talking in hushed whispers, or bigwigs from the company being seen where you would normally not see them, or people from Coca-Cola coming in and you wondering what they're talking about. So there was a little bit of trepidation in the weeks before we were shut down. So in a way, it was just we didn't know what was coming. We didn't know what was going to happen. And then when it happened, it was in some ways a relief, but still sad.
Well, obviously, let's skip forward a few years. You were actually one of the guys that got into retro gaming quite early, because I remember here in the late 90s, you kind of tried to track down Qbert's rights. Yes,
yes and no. I was curious about who owned the rights to Qbert, and I know that I'd been talking with Jeff Lee and Howie Rubin about Qbert and who owned the rights to Qbert, and it wasn't much of a stretch to realize that because Columbia Pictures owned Gottlieb, that when Gottlieb closed, all of the rights reverted to Columbia Pictures. Now, I do believe there were some VPs at Gottlieb who formed a company after Gottlieb was closed, and they tried to get the rights to Qbert. They tried to buy the rights to Qbert, and I don't believe they were successful. Well, obviously they were not, because the rights stayed with Columbia Pictures. And then when Sony bought Columbia Pictures, then again, by one level removed, Sony owned the rights to Qbert. So what happened was, in the mid to late 90s, I'd moved to Los Angeles. I was working for Disney, doing home games with Disney. And I went to a game developers conference, which is held every year up in San Francisco. And I remember going to a table in one of the, it was like the job fair or something, and Sony Computer Entertainment had a table. And I remember walking there up to the Sony guys, and I just said, you guys, why is it? And listen, I was aware that there was now a retro gaming interest. That's something else that happened in the mid-'90s. People started contacting me to talk about Qbert, which I was like, really? That was, 15 years ago. But so I was aware of this sort of retro gaming nostalgia interest, and I said to the guys at Sony, I said, you guys own the rights to Qbert. How come you haven't done anything with it? And I remember the guy I talked to said, we own the rights to Qbert? And he was stunned. He made a note, and he said, I'm going to look into this. And a year later, there was a Qbert version for the PC.
It's crazy to think how many of these big companies that have, acquired other companies have got all these long-lost trademarks in their filing cabinets that they don't even know about.
Yeah. Well, I could, I don't know how I feel about it because obviously I had nothing to do with anything. No one has ever asked me to be involved in a Qbert game. And the other thing is I actually talked to some people from Hasbro Interactive, which is the shop that I think programmed that Qbert that came out for the PC, and I said, I do have some ideas that have never been explored, and if I'd be happy to work with you on that. And they would said, oh yeah, absolutely, we'd love to pick your brain. When can we sit down? And I was like, well, we'd have to work out an agreement. He's like, oh, we don't want to pay you. We just want to hear all your ideas. So I was like, yeah, that's not going to work.
Well, obviously, Qbert has become, an icon in video games, and he's been in movies in recent years, like Pixels and Wreck-It Ralph. Seeing him involved in blockbuster movies, was that a bit surreal?
Oh yeah. I mean, Wreck-It Ralph was kind of lovely. I mean, I'm not sure how I felt when I saw it, and I saw Qbert as this sort of like dejected, down and out guy. I don't know how I felt about the depiction, but on some level, I had to acknowledge that was in some way true. Whereas characters like Frogger and Donkey Kong seem to always get mentioned when anybody ever talked about retro gaming. Qbert would never be mentioned, I would find, or I would say rarely be mentioned. So I was kind of feeling like that really was on the mark. But yeah, I was very grateful, well, maybe not grateful, gratified, let's put it that way, that, Qbert is finding a life now with a younger generation. I think that's awesome. It is a little bit of it's a bitter pill that to see that something you created, you're not in any way, like Sony doesn't acknowledge either me or Jeff or Dave in any way that it was ever created, and so that is a little upsetting. The monetary thing. Listen, that's the law. Unfortunately, it's been true for musicians, for comic book artists, for decades that people create things and don't ever see a monetary, return from that. So really, all that's left is just maybe recognition, and it's very gratifying to see people still responding to the character. That's just wonderful.
I think you're right as well that a new generation is discovering it because, I think when he's brought to life in these movies as well, you see him as kind of a lovable, cuddly character that definitely will appeal to kids in the younger generation, I think. Well,
and it is a shame because I do have some ideas of ways to use this character that I just have never seen anybody even attempt. I actually tried to pitch to Sony. Ironically, I do some consulting work for Sony, and a few years ago, I tried to pitch them some, to do another Qbert game, and they were not interested.
But there was that Qbert rebooted game that came out in 2015, wasn't it? Did you not have any involvement at all with that then?
Nope, not a bit.
Did you play it?
I did, yeah, for a few seconds at the E3 show, but yeah, it's okay. If people like it, then that's great. It's not what I would have done.
So do you think you'll ever get to do anything with Qbert then again, or would you like to if the opportunity was there?
I would. And for years I thought I really wouldn't do it at all. But lately I start to think, if somebody actually did want to work with me on a Qbert game, I'd be happy to do that. Like I said, I do have some ideas. I'd like to pursue. And who knows, maybe I'll just do it on my own. Certainly the tools are there for me to do it on my own. Then it's just really a matter of time. And then of course I'd have to get the rights. So that'd be an interesting endeavor.
Well, even obviously Ready Player One, the movie, is due out very soon. And obviously Qbert's in the book as well, he's referenced. Do you know if he's going to be in the film?
You know, I do not. I do not know that. I would love it if it was, but I'm wondering, again, because getting the rights to characters, to actual video game characters, would be something of a challenge, I think. So, yeah, I don't know how many of those are going to make it into that movie. And Qbert really, I believe, and I read the book, I loved the book, but it was only mentioned, he was only mentioned in passing maybe once. He certainly doesn't figure into the book in a major way.
Well, obviously, Qbert has become part of legendary video games characters. You know, he's up there with the likes of Pac-Man, and it's great just to find out the story of something so iconic. And it must be great for you that people are still interested in this subject, like, you know, nearly 40 years after the original game was conceived.
It's crazy. But like you said, it's very gratifying. I'm certainly thrilled that people like the game, that people still like the game, people like the character. I mean, it's warm and fuzzy all the time.
And what are you working on these days, then, Warren?
You know, I do a lot of things. I still do some software consulting related to the games industry. I also am heavily involved in theater here in Los Angeles, acting and directing. I also do sound design for theater. And I'm also, something I've been talking about for years, I'm actually writing my video game memoir. This is something I literally have been talking about doing for probably 10 years. And finally hunkered down and started doing it. And I hope that by the end of this year, I will actually have a finished book.
Wow.
That will talk about all of my video game stories, because there are quite a few. I realized that there were actually a lot of video game stories. I tell them, here and there. There are some I've never told, and I thought, this probably should just be in a book.
Well, when the book's eventually, ready to be released, we'll definitely be mentioning it on the show, so I'm sure people will hear about it.
I appreciate it. That'd be great.
And fingers crossed one day you can do something with Qbert again. That would be amazing, I think.
Well, thank you very much. From your lips to God's ears.
Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Warren.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.